Hello there and good afternoon. Welcome to today's Ukraine War Q&A with Professor Michael Clarke. It is the 16th of May. Professor Clarke, great to have you with us today. As always, we've had plenty of questions submitted by you guys. Thanks so much for doing that. If you have a question that occurs to you as we're discussing and talking through things today, please submit them via our YouTube channel or on our website, and we'll endeavour to get to them when we can. One of our producers will send them through, and we'll see if we can get them asked to Michael Clarke for you. I always appreciate you sending the questions in beforehand and as we're going along. So, Michael, why don't you get straight into this today? We've seen President Zelensky earlier today. He's at a meeting in Tirana. So obviously the diplomacy, the efforts to try and bring about an end to the war are moving, if not very quickly. There's a meeting at the moment in Istanbul of delegations from both Russia and Ukraine. And the first question from Jarrod is on that diplomacy and where we find ourselves right now. Jarrod asks, what have we learnt from the will he, won't he from Putin this week and his ultimate decision not to engage? It looks from afar that he has them all in the palm of his hands. Remember that President Putin is the one who suggested Istanbul as a meeting place for this, for these talks, and then never turned up.
Yeah, I mean, I think we ought to accept that President Putin is taking quite a lot of risks here because, as you say, last weekend he proposed these talks in Istanbul as a way of putting off the idea of an immediate ceasefire, which otherwise he was being demanded to. The demand was from the Europeans and the United States last weekend, an immediate ceasefire. You must declare it on Monday, 30-day ceasefire. He said, no, I won't do that. We'll have a conference on Thursday. And so here we are on Friday. The conference hasn't got going yet. So he's taking quite a risk because he might have alienated the United States by doing that, but he hasn't so far. It looks as if President Trump has accepted, oh, well, that's okay, he said, that Putin's not at the meeting. If Zelensky had refused to go to the meeting, would you think Trump would have said, well, that's okay, I don't really mind? Of course not. So I wouldn't say that Putin's got the West in the palm of his hand, but he is at the moment making the agenda. He's actually controlling the diplomatic agenda because the United States, quite honestly, is all over the place. And, you know, when I talk to my friends in the diplomatic business and in the security business, you know, the word they use most often for US diplomacy is naive. They say it's naive. Other adjectives are available. But it is naive because it's chaotic. And out of that chaos, President Putin can keep pushing back the idea of a ceasefire because he doesn't want a ceasefire. We all know he doesn't want a ceasefire. President Trump knows he doesn't want a ceasefire, but he's not really prepared to engage in what it would take to make him go for a ceasefire. And that's the question now. It's not what is Putin going to do. We know what Putin's going to do. He's going to keep on playing for time. The question is, what is President Trump going to do? Will he turn away and leave it? Will he blame the Ukrainians? Or will he decide that he can put pressure on Putin to go for a ceasefire? And if there's a 30-day ceasefire, then maybe we could start to talk about something substantive. But so far, we're not even at first base yet in negotiating terms. We're not actually at the first base. We're still talking about getting to first base. And that's because that's the way the Russians are orchestrating it.
Yeah, I mean, the ball is in his court, as Mark Rutte said earlier. I mean, if he hasn't got people in the palm of his hand, has he got the whip hand? Has he got, like, control of where this goes from here in terms of ceasefire? And you say he doesn't want a ceasefire. But also, he must know that at this point, and in the next 6 months to a year, he can't take Ukraine as he wanted to back in 2022.
That's
maybe
a good point, Kamali. I mean, the point is he certainly doesn't want a ceasefire now because he's going all out to grab as much territory as possible. Not very successfully, I have to say, on a day-to-day basis. By the end of the year, depending on what Ukraine does, depending on the amount of help Ukraine gets from the Western world, whether the Europeans with the US or without the US, that's all a variable. But it's entirely plausible that by the end of the year, Putin will want a ceasefire because if he starts to lose territory that he's taken for granted is his, if his lines start to get pushed back, then he might be more interested in a ceasefire. But while he thinks his lines are still going forward, albeit at a snail's pace, he's not particularly interested. I was looking earlier on, I mean, over a year ago, in February last year, they took Avdiivka. The Russians took Avdiivka. That was a very big plus for them. It was a big defeat for the Ukrainians. They've held Avdiivka since 2014, and they lost it. Now the Russians are going for Pokrovsk. They still haven't taken Pokrovsk, and Pokrovsk is only 30 miles away from Avdiivka. Yeah. And it's taken them 15 months to get 30 miles. And that's not exactly a strategic breakthrough.
No, losing thousands and thousands a day in that effort to try and take Pokrovska. We'll talk about why that's so important to them in a moment. But we've got some questions that have come in from YouTube. Thank you very much for that. 2 questions here. I'm going to get through both of them. Darcy Azate. I'm sorry if I got your name wrong, Darcy, but I do appreciate you submitting the question anyway. And it's on exactly Putin's sort of motivation and what he's trying to do. How does Putin backing out of the negotiations reflect with the general populace of Russia? I mean, there's some sort of conditions on that. I guess that the people in Russia know that he had set this up and that, he was going to perhaps not follow through on his word.
Yeah, it's very hard to work out what Russian opinion is. The Levada Institute is the most independent polling institute that exists in Russia, and its polls are the best we've got. And they indicate that when this war started, the most Russians concentrated on the economy. What they wanted was just economic development. And they weren't terribly keen on the war, but they thought it was necessary because they've been given that line. Now, more Russians now think that the war is a patriotic duty than before, but they're weary of it. And I think, Russian public opinion seems to be rather brittle. They want their boys to win. They want the Russian objectives to be achieved because it's their boys fighting. But they want the war to finish, just like the Ukrainians. They're fed up with the war, but they don't want to express too much of an opinion against it because Russia's a very repressive state. And so the sense that the Putin is prolonging the direction of ceasefire, prolonging the road to a ceasefire, I don't think the Russian public will blame him for that because they've taken on board pretty well everything he's fed them. Yeah. That this is really about the security of Russia itself, that the West is attacking Russia, using Ukraine as the front line, and that the Russians have got to somehow prevail in this. It's a complete reversion from, inversion of reality. But the evidence is that the Russian public is reluctantly coming to the same sort of conclusion, even though, as I say, their opinion is probably quite brittle. Yeah. And if there was 3 or 4 disasters, for the Russians, they might click over and say, look, just end the war. But they're not saying that at the moment because they still believe that the Russians will gain some significant advantages in Ukraine this year.
I wonder with the way that Putin has controlled information within Russia as well, and the figure that he has made himself in the Russian sort of mind, him suggesting talks and then not going to the talks again shows him as being the power broker, doesn't it?
It does.
I wonder if that works for his...
And the Russians rather like the idea that their leader is clever.
Yeah.
That goes deep into Russian culture. Yeah, it's not a culture of compassion, or a great deal of humility. It's a culture of strength and cleverness. And that one of the most interesting things that was said by Medvedev a couple of weeks ago, and it absolutely expresses Russian thinking at the moment. He said NATO... And I should say that Medvedev is a previous prime minister, previous president. Yeah. He's not really close to the decision. I mean, he's not really one of the top decision makers, but he's in that mold and he tries to say what the top guys like to hear. And he said NATO talks about peace through strength. They always use that phrase, peace through strength. Now, that's not what we talk about. He said peace through fear. Huh. That's what works, peace through fear, because we have shown that peace through fear works. And what he's really saying is that Russia has given up on peaceful coexistence. They don't believe in that. Last time they had peaceful coexistence during the Cold War, they lost it. They lost the peaceful competition with the West in 1991 when the Soviet Union collapsed. And they all think that was a terrible tragedy, a historic injustice. And that's what Medvedev says. No, what we need in Russia is peace through fear, because we have to make our neighbours fear us. And that's the point. That's the world, sadly, in which we're now living.
Yeah, we've entered that space, haven't we, where they are an aggressive, domineering...
because they only feel safe if other people feel unsafe.
Yeah.
And that's the circle we're trying to square.
Almost impossible, isn't it? Right. Question again from YouTube. Barnaby Thorngate. Thank you for this one, Barnaby. It's about ceasefire again. And Barnaby would like to know, is it in Ukraine's interest to have a ceasefire for a couple of months?
For sure. I mean, the Ukrainians need a break. They could do with the rest, as anyone would. If there's a ceasefire, the boys and girls on the front line will actually take a rest. They'll re-equip. They'll, get some order restored. They'll reorganize themselves. Everybody would like a ceasefire. Everyone on the front line would. And Ukraine can certainly benefit from a ceasefire for all of those reasons. What Ukraine doesn't want, of course, is a 30-day or even a 90-day ceasefire that leads to a peace process which is imposed on them, which is imposed over their heads by Putin and Trump meeting individually and ignoring Ukraine. And what the Europeans have always said is no peace deal without the Ukrainians at the table. And, it goes back to the old thing that you and I talked about before. In diplomatic terms, if you're not at the table, you're probably on the menu. That's the point. And if the Ukrainians are not at the table when it comes to a peace deal, they are certainly going to be on the menu.
Yeah, well, we heard earlier President Trump suggesting meeting with Putin. They're going to try and put that together soon. And that will be a meeting.
If I was Zelensky, I'd be really worried about that.
It's going to exclude them entirely, isn't it? Let's just bring this question in from Liam. You submitted this question before our discussion got going. It's actually on the topic we were talking about and Putin's sort of strategy. Liam asks, I've read many times Stalin was an arch manipulator who was able to run rings around Churchill and Roosevelt in negotiations. Is Putin on par with Stalin and doing the same?
Oh, Putin would like to be like Stalin in many respects. You know, Stalin wasn't that clever. I mean, he was completely deceived by Hitler. I mean, Stalin went into with the Nazi-Soviet non-aggression pact of 1939, which basically, blew the whistle on the Second World War beginning, and was they were fellow dictators carving up Europe. And then Hitler turned on him in June 1941, and Stalin was completely naive about that.
Was he wrong-footed? Because some of the revisionist history suggests that Stalin kind of knew it was going to happen, and he was preparing.
He should have known. I mean, his intelligence was telling him the Germans were planning this enormous Operation Barbarossa. I mean, everybody could see it
coming.
But he still stuck to the terms of their deal, hoping that he somehow had a special line with Hitler, and he didn't. And so in that respect, I mean, Stalin was in a sense very naive, or he just hoped against experience that it would be okay. And then, of course, they were confronted with the enormous invasion, which was 27 million Russians, or 27 million Soviet citizens, I should say, died in the Second World War. Most of it, proportionally, more in Ukraine. More Ukrainians died than Russians, proportionately. And so, that's the way it was. Stalin then was, did he outwit the Roosevelt and Churchill? Well, he thought he had Roosevelt. He thought that Roosevelt it was sort of soft on him. I don't think he ever outwitted Churchill. Churchill was always very clear about what Stalin didn't want, and Churchill was very realistic about it, but then Britain wasn't in a position to do very much about it. The country that could have done something about it in the Yalta Agreement of February 1945, the one that more or less created the divisions of Europe that we lived with afterwards. Roosevelt was clear. He thought he could get on with Stalin. Stalin encouraged that idea. But I mean, when it came to Yalta in February 1945, I mean, Roosevelt was a very sick man.
I was going to say, he's getting to the end of it.
He died in April the 12th.
Yeah.
So he was literally 2 months away from his death. And Roosevelt was he just, he'd lost his grip on what really was going on in Yalta.
I mean, he'd served, I think that was 3 terms by that point, or 4 terms.
He was in his 4th term.
Right.
He was in his 4th term.
And a thing that I only learned later in life, not at school, was that he was in the wheelchair. That's why all of those all those pictures are taken of him sitting down.
And he was in a wheelchair for almost all of his presidential career. And it was kept from the American people. You could never do that now, of course.
No one knew.
And when he went to Yalta, the other thing is that Churchill wasn't reading any of the briefing papers that the Foreign Office provided for him, because he knew it all. He'd been there. He'd lived it. And he was reading Dickens again and Emily Bronte. He was reading the classics at Yalta. And he was tired. So you had one man, Roosevelt, who was dying. You had another man who was so tired he wouldn't read his stuff. And you had Stalin, who was certifiably paranoid. And the three of them sat at Yalta and remade the post-war world.
Well, carved it all up, and we're living with some of the results of that now. Slight digression, guys, but we've got Michael here, so could always pull amazing facts out of his head, Michael. We do appreciate you. All right, let's move on to another question here from a Snowman12 about these talks. What, if anything, can be achieved from the talks that we're seeing right now? Can Ukraine at least give the Russian delegation a sense of what they would want from a peace deal? I mean, we've heard a little bit from the Ukrainian delegation this morning saying that they will not have these talks pick up from where the last talks ended in 2022. But that's kind of exactly where the Russians want to begin them. Yeah,
it's a very good question, actually. What could the Ukrainians offer to the Russians that the Russians would find meaningful? And in a way, what they could offer now is what they were offering before the war started, which is to say, look, OK, we could agree to be a neutral country. We could agree never to join NATO, never to try to join NATO. Maybe we could agree never to join the EU, although we would very much like to. That was all a possibility. And in a way, it's based on the Austrian State Treaty of 1955. I mean, Austria became a neutral country that was very Western-leaning, as rich as the West, but wasn't part of the West. And from 1955 onwards, I mean, because the Russians occupied Austria, most of it anyway, after the Second World War, and then withdrew. And Austria then, that withdrawal was based on the idea that the Austrian State Treaty would keep Austria neutral. That was a model for Ukraine, and the Ukrainians were prepared to offer that and would still more or less offer it. But they have to know that Russia would leave them as a viable state that can arm itself, against its security threats in the future. And that's what the Russians won't live with at the moment. They want to create a Ukraine if it still exists, as a state which is unviable. If they have to live with Ukraine, they want it to be an unviable state with no appreciable armed forces, so wide open to a future invasion, possibly landlocked, so it's not economically viable because it can't get its exports out through the Bosphorus into the Mediterranean, and a state which hasn't got a lot going for it, really, even though it's physically a big state and with a population of over 30 million, even without the occupied territories. So Ukraine could offer the Russians something, but what they can offer them now is what they were offering before the war started.
Yeah.
An essentially neutral but viable state that could lead its own free market, sort of Western style development.
But they won't have that, will they, the Russians? They won't have
a
thriving...
And now that they've invested so much in the war, 1 million casualties, turn themselves into a war economy, doing whatever it takes. And Putin is now a war leader. His power, his continuation of power depends upon being a war leader. Depends upon continual war. This is his 5th war in 25 years, as The Economist keeps pointing out. 5 wars in 25 years. Yeah. There's no reason to believe that he actually wants a long-term peace, because that's not good for his rule, the way he does it. So the Ukrainians now know that what they offered before the war started in 2021, 22, is probably not adequate anyway. But it's all they could logically offer if they are to remain a viable sovereign state.
Quick thought, and you've moved us on to Bob's question here as well. Have we seen a single sign that Putin wants to bring this war to an end? And Bob asks, is there anything currently in it for him to end? From what you've just said, he is a war leader now. He's leading a state that has completely switched its economy to be one that produces weapons and is fighting against its neighbours. Yeah,
everything we know about Putin's belief and the people around him is absolutely consistent, which is Ukraine does not deserve to exist as a state. It shouldn't be a state. And again, when people ask me this question, I refer them to a very long essay, about an 8,000-word essay that Putin produced in the summer, I think it was July 2021, the year before the war started, which was on the historical nature of Russian and Ukrainian society. And historically, it was rubbish. But it was a long essay about how Ukraine really isn't a proper state and so on and so forth. And you look at that, and I remember at the time my friends in the security business saying to me, look at that document. That document really is authentically Putin. And I heard that from a number of people. That is authentically Putin. And it was actually, Patrushev wrote a lot of it, who was his kind of mentor. And Alexander Dugin was thought to have some input to the earlier versions of that. But that was authentically Putin, it was thought. And then look at any of Putin's speeches from 2007 onwards. He went to the Munich Security Conference in 2007, issued a very angry series of statements, and from then on, he was very clear that he's never accepted Ukraine as a state. And so there is a sense in which Putin's work will not seem done to him if by the time he leaves power or dies, Ukraine is not reabsorbed into Russia. He's absolutely consistent on that, and there's no ambiguity about it. No. Those who say it's not what Putin wants, Steve Witkoff said, why would they want the rest of the Ukraine? Well, I said, Mr. Witkoff, read a book. Any book, really. Any book on Russian history probably do. Read his speeches, read his document of 2021.
He's been telling us, and that's why it's, when you look back at that period up to February 2022, when it was, will he or will he not invade? If you think about it, realistically, all the signs were there that it was absolutely going to happen. He'd made the justification, false justification, as you rightly point out, but he had been leading up to that point.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. And of course, and there've been big exercises the year before, and they've been called off. And the argument was, well, look, these are just big exercises. He wants something. He wants to frighten people. Then he'll call them off. And you remember the thing. I think you and I were talking about it at one stage back in 2022. The thing that convinced me that this invasion was going to happen about 10 days, 2 weeks before it actually happened, before the 24th of February, was that they brought blood supplies to the exercises. You say you don't bring fresh blood to an exercise unless you intend to spill some blood. And that's the point. Yeah.
It's a sign, wasn't it, that they were about to march across the border. We've got a question here that's come in from Antonio on YouTube. Thank you for this, Antonio. And it's right in my field. Breaking news. Yeah. It's Antonio's updating us that the negotiations in Istanbul have ended. Lasted just 2 hours. Yeah. And Antonio would like to get your take on the duration. I have an opinion on it, but you're the expert.
Well, it's not that surprising. They would have only dealt with two possible things. One is some of the peripheral issues, such as prisoner exchanges, prisoner swaps, but they've been going on regularly in any case, so they don't need to go to Istanbul to agree another prisoner swap. And possibly the issue of getting Ukrainian children back, although that's quite a sensitive one for the Russians because they have to admit that they've been abducted to make some progress there. So you're not going to do that. You're not going to do much of that at an open conference. And I'm sure the rest of it was about, as Marco Rubio said, negotiations about negotiations, talks about talks. I mean, over a month ago, Rubio said, we've had enough talks about talks. We've had enough negotiations about negotiations. I'm pretty sure that when we see the communique that comes out of this Istanbul meeting, it'll be negotiations about something new. I mean, the next stage.
I mean, the telling thing will be if they say that they give us a hard date, a point that we can look towards where they're going to do this again. Because 2 hours of talks by that delegation, low-level delegation, would seem to me is completely pointless.
And the first couple of hours of most things are taken up by opening statements. So people make their opening statements, and that takes up, a good hour or so. And what they normally say is, there's an agenda. You go through our items, agenda items 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and the other side says, okay, our items are 7 to 12, and everybody goes through their agenda items. That's what normally happens.
Coffee break, and then you come back and you're all done.
That's right. Yeah. And then somebody says, what are we going to say for the communique? And so you argue about the wording of a communique, which is read out by the chairperson, whoever it is. I mean, you can use up 2 hours in doing nothing at all, to be honest.
Well, we'll see if there is a communique issued as a result of that. We'll know that the Turks definitely would like there to be some kind of movement, as they're the ones hosting it, Hakan Fidan, the foreign minister, hosting it. Let's move on to some quick-fire questions, Michael. I know you love this round. I'm not going to time you because I don't want to get myself in trouble. And you can't stick to 30 seconds. But this first one you probably do in 30 seconds. So it's kind of about the children that you were discussing here. Putin is the subject of an ICJ arrest warrant.
ICC
arrest warrant. And Ward asks the question, can Putin be arrested if he were to enter Turkey?
No, because Turkey is not a signatory to the International Criminal Court. So I think it's 125, 126 states are signed up. Turkey isn't one of them.
The statute, I believe.
That's right, the Rome Statute. And Turkey is not a member of that, so Putin is free to travel to Turkey because they're not bound to arrest him. If he travelled to Italy, they are a signatory, they'd be bound to arrest him. Or to create some mechanism which says we derogate from the ICC for the next 2 weeks to allow this summit to take place. I mean, that would be a political decision. But the simple answer is no, he's free to travel to Turkey without the ICC being able to arrest him.
Which is probably why he suggested that as a spot where they can get into and out.
I mean, he has a problem going to South Africa, for instance, because they are a signatory to the ICC.
Yeah, but they've got a history of not extraditing people. Bashir was there from Sudan and wasn't sent to the ICC, was he?
Exactly.
Yeah, he was able to come in and out of the country. All right, another quick-fire question here from Glyn. How likely is it that the Russian army the morale of the Russian army breaks, given the huge casualties and disregard for lives seeming from the higher echelons, from the officer class?
Well, in a sense, the morale already has broken because they're using them in human wave attacks. I mean, the latest information from the Institute for the Study of War, which are very good on these things, they say that they're pretty sure now that Russia is replacing its battlefield losses, which it wasn't doing until recently. So it's actually putting more people onto the battlefield than they're losing. They're losing 1,300 a day. They're putting more people forward. But these people have got a month's training. So they do a month's basic training for being a civilian, and then they go to the battlefield, they go to the front. And their morale is pretty bad, but I mean, they're being used more or less in human wave attack. I mean, although they're in small squads, they're just being sent forward, and if they come back, they get shot. So they just keep on going forward until they get shot or wounded. Now, that, for most armies, they'd say, well, that means your morale is lousy anyway, and you're just using people as fodder. And then your professional soldiers, the more elite units, are following up after the fodder has cleared the ground or has actually revealed the firing positions of the enemy and so on. That's what they're doing. I mean, I don't think there's any chance that the Russians are going to crack because they, so far, they're able to feed more and more people into this, and they've got a war economy which is feeding stuff in. It's not very good stuff, the equipment. I mean, most of their tanks are now refurbs. Very few new tanks, actually. It's only about a quarter of their tanks are new tanks that they're producing. 3/4 are just reconditioned old tanks. But the Russian army is a bit like a sponge. It's not going to crack because it's not brittle in that respect. It's not brittle the way a modern army would be brittle, which tries to do clever things and is able to engage in manoeuvre warfare. This is an army which is doing the very basics in a very 19th century way. So it's an army, it's a bit like a sponge.
One thing that always fascinates me about the army, Michael, and I don't know if we've talked about this before, but answer my question now. The fact that this does seem like a generational fight for Putin, and he's, as you say, re-equipped the economy for it to be a war economy. You're going to have young people going into the army who have seen war around them for the past 3 years, longer. Do you then start to get recruits who are fully signed up to this idea of fighting this special military operation, this war, and then you start to get a level of troop that's sort of ideologically driven to join the army, rather than people sort of being grabbed in off the street, press gang to fight.
Well, I think there's always a core of that. There's people who join any army for a sense of patriotism and because it's exciting, or they think it's going to be exciting till they get there. But increasingly, the evidence is that this particular army, I mean, they're on the third army now. They've gone through their first professional army. They've gone through their second army. This is now an army that has only ever known Ukraine as the battlefront, and they're getting their training in the battle itself, and which is why their tactics are so poor, because there isn't time for them to work on other tactics, to exercise and do it safely. They have to do it on the front line. So what they're doing on the front line is the very basics. Will it produce a generation of patriotic Russians? I don't know. I think it's producing a generation of even more cynical Russians.
Right.
And we know that most of those who are going for the contract now, who are joining voluntarily, are just joining for the money.
Oh, you get paid well, don't you, when you join the
Hugely
army?
well.
And you get paid well if you die. The family gets paid
And your
off
family
this.
get a lot of money, and it means that you can afford. Your daughter can buy a house with a new son, with the son-in-law, and your wife gets a car, and so on. All of those things happen. If you look at what Russia is spending on paying soldiers and the families of soldiers, it now accounts, according to some versions, of 1.5% of its GDP. Now, Russian GDP is about 2.4 trillion dollars, something like that, to maybe 2.2 billion dollars. It's not as high as Britain's GDP, for instance. But I mean, 1.5% of that is a lot of money.
$2 trillion.
2 trillion.
Yeah,
That's what it is now. Yeah, it used to be 1.7, I think. So if it's 2 trillion, 1.5% of 2 trillion is a lot of money.
Oh, yeah.
And that's what they're spending on soldiers and their families.
Incredible. And it just keeps them being fed into the meat grinder, doesn't it? Remember, this was the quickfire round, so I'm sorry about that. That's my fault. I shouldn't have asked a follow-up. In the quickfire, Peter A. has asked this: can the UK be protected against multiple conventional missile attack, and would such attacks provoke a full response? It's a slight tangential point, but I'm sure you can answer that about
short answer is no.
Okay.
We're wide open to ballistic missile attacks in this country. The only defence we've got are Sea Viper missiles, which are on the Daring-class destroyers. We've got 6 of those, but only 3 of them are operational at the moment. So we've got the missiles that are available on 3 destroyers. Those missiles are there to defend the destroyer or a ship close to the destroyer that the destroyer is looking after. The idea that they could defend any significant part of the UK is fanciful, even if they're all in the same, even if they're all in the channel next to each other. Could their Sea Vipers defend against something coming in towards London? Well, 1 or 2 missiles, but 8, 10, no.
Yeah.
And in a sense, we've never had to think about this until recently. And our defence isn't defence, it's deterrence.
Yeah.
We say that if we are attacked in that sort of way, we have a deterrent, a nuclear
Which is
deterrent,
the
if it happens.
option.
And so would we apply that nuclear deterrent, the Vanguard submarines, against a conventional ballistic missile attack? And that is one of the great unanswered questions of nuclear strategy. Would you actually do it?
Remains unanswered, doesn't it? I mean, the full
Thankfully.
response in Peter's question here is that whether or not we would go nuclear if we were attacked conventionally.
If we were attacked conventionally in a huge way, I mean, it would have to be huge. Would we use our nuclear weapons? And of course, the government will never say yes or no because they want to maintain that ambiguity. That's the whole point. If your opponent doesn't know if you'll do it, they're more likely to be deterred than if you've made statements that make them think that they can know exactly where your red line is. Once you say where your red line is, they go right up to it.
Yeah.
So you've got to be ambiguous about what your red line is when you're dealing with these sort of issues of deterrence.
Absolutely. All right, let's crack on with some more of the full questions, Michael. And this one has come in from Wilf UK, and it's about a Ukrainian F-16. Wilf asks, how did Ukraine lose an F-16, and what does unusual situation leading to the pilot ejecting mean? That is the reporting that's come in about Ukraine losing this fighter jet. There's an emergency situation. The pilot had to eject. The pilot is satisfactory, the Ukrainians tell us. He's not in danger, but of course they lost the jet.
They did. It's the second one that we know of that they've lost. It happens. The report today was that he engaged 3 targets, and then this happened at night, and then something happened. Either he was hit, maybe ground fire, maybe it was another jet. Whether he actually engaged and shot down 3, I'd rather doubt. I mean, Ukrainians do sort of overstate what they achieve in the air. They always have done. And it is difficult in air combat to be completely clear about it. But it's not surprising that if the F-16s are in action, some of them are going to be lost. And it could be either to another jet, It could be to ground-based fire from the Russian side. It could be to a technical fault. I mean, the jet may have just developed a technical fault, or it could be friendly fire.
Yeah.
You can always get shot down by your own side. It does happen. And the main thing is, I would guess anyway, that the pilot ejected and is in safe hands on the Ukrainian side of the border, and the jet, one hopes, is also on the Ukrainian side of the border, not on the Russian or the occupied territory side of the border, when in that case the Russians will be stripping it down and having a really good look at it.
Taking all the technology they could from it. Just a quick thought on that. Do the jets that have been provided, I think these jets have been provided by the Netherlands and others. I can't quite find in front of me in my notes the other nation that's donated these F-16s. The Netherlands and Denmark. What kind of state are they in? I mean, are these old planes? You talk about technical issues.
These were the aircraft that were being withdrawn to be replaced by the F-35.
Right.
And so they're a previous generation of aircraft, whereas the F-35 is fifth generation, and these were sort of third, fourth generation aircraft. But when they're reconditioned, they're still pretty good, and they're good. They're good for lots of things. They're good for air-to-air fighting. They're good for ground attack and standoff missiles. They won't win the war for Ukraine, but they're certainly glad to have them. We don't know how many they've got. The Ukrainians are very cagey about how many they're actually operating. Yeah. We think, maybe 100, maybe 150, something of that order. They've got more than a dozen, but they haven't got several hundred. That's the point.
But as many as 150? So
they might have. Well, something of that order. They might have.
You didn't give me a big...
Yes,
You're not going to tell me what the actual number is, but I didn't realise it was that number.
Those are the sort of orders that they're talking about. They might be talking it up a little bit.
Okay, let's move to another question that's come in from YouTube, from Dex Dickens. Thank you very much for this question. Dex, what's your opinion on Russia moving forces toward other NATO countries' borders, and what are the plans there? I mean, they are moving forces, or they have moved forces into Belarus for Zapad, the manoeuvres
big
Zapad, which of course means west as well, which strikes fear into my heart when I think think about that idea.
Zapad, No, they're opening up some bases on the Norwegian, on the Finnish border rather. Petrozavodsk is one of them. Kamina is another one. And in Kaliningrad as well. There's about 4 or 5 bases. Some of them are old air bases that they're reopening. And they look as if they're opening or starting a base for armoured vehicles and for troops. So there's 4 or 5 areas in which they're opening several bases along the Finnish border, and then they're strengthening Kaliningrad. At the moment, they haven't got very much there. And these bases are, somebody said, I mean, they're like, sort of just framework bases.
Right.
They're not really so important, but they will become, or can become important. I mean, the Russians could, it is said, they could increase their forces in that area by anything between 30 and 50%, and they might. But they wouldn't do that unless there's some sort of ceasefire in Ukraine. And the bases are to be expected because Finland joined the alliance and Russia said, well, we will respond. And they are responding by, as it were, strengthening that border. Yeah. But it's nothing to be particularly alarmed about at the moment.
Well, that question from you, from Dex, but Ahmed had submitted a question similar to that earlier. And I hope that answers your question, Ahmed. But Ahmed does have a point in here I think you can answer. Does this mean that, when they're moving these troops to the bases, that they plan to attack NATO? And Mike, you always tell me that very interesting thing about when we know that the Russians are about to attack. You talked about the blood earlier. Yeah. You can see where the forces are being moved, and that gives you a great sense as to whether or not they're going to be seriously making maneuvers.
Yeah. You can normally tell by the basing whether you're dealing with garrison forces or screening forces or forces getting ready for an attack. And in the case of just being over the border from Finland, we'd have a pretty good view of it. It's not as if, you're not talking here about Western Russia opposite Sumy around Kharkiv, where it's more difficult to work out quite what the Russians are doing without specialist intelligence. In the case of just over the border from Finland, it would be a matter of public understanding, where there are concentrations of forces and what they've got there and what it would look like. So I think we're a long way away from the idea of an attack on Finland. But, I mean, pressure on the Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, is looking more and more likely. And the Baltics themselves say that we are in line for some sort of Russian move of some sort, particularly in somewhere like Narva, which is basically a Russian city inside, the Baltics. And so the idea of Russian forces all the way along that western border of NATO now, that new western border of NATO, is a reality for the future. But I think we should be worrying for what's going to happen in 2 to 5 years' time. But this year, I think it is all preparation.
Okay, well,
no more than preparation.
More than preparation, right? So follow up to that question from Football, who's submitted this on YouTube. If the war were to stop in Ukraine now, will Russia re-equip, invest more in its technology in terms of modernising it with the latest kit, and then maybe go again in the Baltic states? Is that a
it's entirely I don't know if they will, but it's entirely plausible. I mean, the Russian Navy is in pretty good shape. The Northern Fleet, the Pacific Fleet are still what they were with more modern stuff. They've not been engaged. It's the Black Sea Fleet that's suffered. And they can't reinforce it because they can't move through the straits because Turkey won't let them. That's fine from Ukraine's point of view. The Russian Air Force hasn't really engaged in Ukraine. They've held the Air Force back because they fear Western air forces, which are more powerful and stronger. Even without the United States, they're more powerful. And so the Russians have held back their Air Force in case they lose too much of it in Ukraine. It's the Russian ground forces are what's taken the strain, and they would have to reconstitute their ground forces and modernise them much more. They've lost a lot of equipment, and they'd have to reorganise their force. So that would take a little time. But the Navy, their Air Force, and their missile forces are still very modern. Their nuclear forces are all updated, and the ground forces would catch up pretty quickly if they had a pause in Ukraine. Most analysts would say, 2 to 3 years, and they'll have an army of 1.5 million by then. Which they'll be able to use. They'll be able to actually reorganise it in a bigger way.
It's incredible to think we have this ever-present threat now for the next decade at least. All right, a couple more questions, Michael. Thank you very much for your indulgence. Do appreciate it, and I'm sure our viewers do as well. All right, this one comes from Matt, who says, Ukraine have made a couple of breakthroughs into Russia over the border. Why haven't they managed it over the front line? They've been into Kursk, they've been into Belgorod as well, where they've held territory. They've been able to fight the Russians off. I mean, Matt's point is, why can't they do that on the front lines down in the Donbass?
And they did it on the front lines as well in the autumn of 2022. They did it in Kharkiv. They threw the Russians out of most of the Kharkiv province, and in half of Kherson. They got, to the western side of the Dnieper River. They sort of threw the Russians out onto the other side of the river. So they did do it. They can do it. What it takes to do it is, first of all, a concentration of forces, which they don't have at the moment. And secondly, they caught the Russians by surprise in all of those cases. In Kursk, in Belgorod, in Kharkiv, and in Kherson. They caught, unprepared, less than front-line Russian forces and took them by surprise. And they could still do that. But what they can't do is bring big force to bear on a front where the Russians are expecting them. And neither can the Russians. They can't do it either. And so neither side is able to make a strategic breakthrough. They have made it when they've taken the other by surprise, but only in those conditions so far.
Do you describe it as stalemate at the moment? How do you describe sort of the dynamism of the front?
It's not. I sometimes use the word stalemate, but I shouldn't really. It's not a stalemate in the sense that the First World War, the trenches in the First World War were a stalemate, that they didn't move for months and months, or in some cases years at a time. It's not like that. But the progress is essentially at a snail's pace. So the Russians undoubtedly are making progress. They're taking more territory than they had. They start off in 2022 with about a third of the Donbass under their control. Now they've got more than 2/3, getting towards 3/4. So they've crawled to that in 3 years, more than 3 years. And so it's not a stalemate, but actually it's moving slowly.
Grindingly slow.
Because neither side has the strength to punch through the other side and encircle them and make some big gains. I mean, that's what modern warfare depends upon maneuver. And to punch through the other side, get into the area behind the lines, encircle an army and make it surrender, give it no option but to surrender, and then you're moving. Then you move to the capital cities, whatever it might be. Neither side has been able to do that.
So, okay, let's move on to a question here from Boop, who's put this in from YouTube, and it's been discussed today when Keir Starmer arrived in Tirana for that European community meeting. He talked about these sanctions being imposed on Russia because, of course, did they set a red line? But whatever they said in Kyiv a couple of weeks ago about the ceasefire coming in, if you don't do it, we're going to impose these sanctions. Boop wants to know what will cause Europe and the US to impose secondary sanctions on Russia in regards to oil in gas. And I know what you're going to ask me about the oil price. I've already checked. It's at 61, 61 a barrel. We go through this every single week.
It's stabilised since last week.
It's just ticked up a bit, actually, 62.
Yeah, it's stabilised a bit since last week, I think. Yes, the question of sanctions is an interesting one in the sense that the Europeans can impose more sanctions. They can chase their present sanctions as well. But the sanctions that would make a difference would be secondary sanctions on Russia's oil trade. And President Trump has talked about that. It's not clear that he wants to do it or he's willing really to do it, but we'll see. And when the Europeans talk about sanctions, they're really talking about chasing the sanctions they've already imposed and creating some new ones. But European sanctions without the United States, they're not ineffective, but they won't be decisive. Mm-hmm. But European sanctions with powerful US sanctions behind them might be decisive, at least in bringing Putin to a ceasefire deal, if President Trump would be prepared to do it. But he's shown no sign yet, other than rhetorically, that he is prepared to do it.
And again, rhetorically, Keir Starmer has said it, so we will see when this meeting breaks up in Tirana whether or not him, President Macron, Donald Tusk and the others, Friedrich Merz, will issue some kind of statement to that effect.
And the sanctions would have to be national sanctions because the EU finds it now very difficult to get into a fresh round of sanctions. It keeps trying. Ursula von der Leyen of the Commission keeps coming up with very ambitious proposals, and of course they're opposed immediately by Hungary and Slovakia, who will oppose anything that is against Putin's interests. And so it's very hard to have a sanctions package that keeps them on board. And they do stay on board for the packages, but only if they're given sweeteners. You have to keep buying them off and buying them off. And each package of sanctions gets diluted. Yeah. And increasingly, the sanctions that would really matter will be sanctions taken nationally by those states like Britain and France and Germany who are prepared to stick with it and take some pain themselves.
Yeah. Absolutely. All right. Let's move on to the final question then, Mike. We've just ticked over the 2 o'clock hour, so we've kept you for quite long enough. I know you've got your Friday afternoon to look after and to look forward to. This is a question from whatever, and it's a hypothetical. I love these kind of things, and I hope you'll indulge us on this sort of thing. But it's great to have a historian who will have a deep knowledge of how this could work. It's a counterfactual. So in a hypothetical case, forget about Article 5, whatever asks, had Russia attacked another European state like Poland, Germany or Italy, how would they have fared in comparison to Ukraine, do you think?
Oh, well, it's a complete hypothetical. In Poland's case, they'd have fared pretty much like Ukraine for similar reasons. Germany or Italy would have just rolled over. Wow. Couldn't have withstood it without Article 5. Because Poland and Germany, rather than Italy, were so completely militarily unprepared that they relied on Article 5 effectively to protect them. Article 5, the NATO article that means an attack on one shall be interpreted as an attack on all. But if you were setting this up as a staff college exercise, a Russian attack against Germany, who would win? Russia. A Russian attack against Italy, who would win? Russia.
Right.
Russian attack against Poland, who would win? It'd probably end up a bit like the Ukraine war now.
They'd fight themselves to this grindingly slow stalemate. I mean, Poland has a huge standing army, doesn't it? And it's
that's right, yeah.
As well.
Oh, well over 100,000. It's moving to much bigger than that, towards 200,000 with a big reserve. 5% of GDP they're going to spend on defence. I mean, the Poles are taking this very, very seriously. Yeah. They are the third biggest armed forces in Europe, behind Turkey in NATO, or behind Turkey in the United States. They are emerging as a major player. And they're having elections this weekend. Really important.
Right. So we'll see what direction the country goes in.
Yeah.
Professor Clarke, it's always a pleasure. Thank you so much for that. I'm not going to make any promises about doing it next week, because I did that last week and then we managed to miss the date for schedules that we couldn't match up the schedule, but we will try. We thank you again for all of your questions, of course, for submitting them while we were going along and for submitting them before. And I promise we will see you again very soon. Enjoy your Friday, enjoy your weekend.